I think you'll all agree it's been an amazing day so far, and I just want to remind you that this evening we'll be having a reception at the Kluge-Ruhe Aboriginal Art Collection. So please join us for a glass of wine and a chance to speak informally with all of the speakers today. So, the old and the new. So much of the sessions today have been grappling with these questions of innovation and tradition, of art and ethnography, of history. And so in this final session, we're really hoping to pull some of those threads together to think about how Indigenous Australian art exists in contemporary art discourse. And I was speaking with somebody earlier. I was speaking with Richard earlier, and I guess some of these things have to be aspirational, right? Some of these questions have to be, how do we want the world to be, as much as how the world is? How do we see our role as artists, as curators, academics, as not just recounting the history of art, but moving it forwards in new ways? And I think that coming after somebody as influential and significant as Balang John Moanjul, who has really spent his life giving us the inspiration of how to balance the new and the old, it's a nice way to end the day. So I have two speakers today who are very, very dear to my heart. The first of them, I suppose if I was following Aboriginal kinship protocols, I would have to call him my father, somebody who's been an immense mentor to me, has the dubious honour of having supervised my dissertation, my PhD. But Terry Smith is the Andrew W. Mellon Professor of Contemporary Art History and Theory at the University of Pittsburgh. And for nearly 50 years, he has been one of the most incisive analysts of contemporary art. After Terry, we'll have a very dear friend of mine, Maia Nuku, making her third appearance in this venue, which is magnificent. The Evelyn A. Hall and John A. Friede Associate Curator of Oceanic Art at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. For those of you who don't know that, it's the one on Fifth Avenue, isn't it? It's the little one. Maia's current, I tell that joke all the time, I've got to get some new material. It would have been funnier if I'd done it in that New York accent, wouldn't it? Maia's current exhibition, Atea Nature and Divinity in Polynesia, is on display at the Met until October 27th. I would highly recommend that you go and see it. It is an extraordinary exhibition that does some amazingly groundbreaking things curatorially. So as a way to end the day, I think that is magnificent. And we'll be finishing that with a discussion with Terry and Maia and John Mundine back for his encore performance. But before then, I'm going to hand over to Terry Smith.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Let me first acknowledge the Monacan people as traditional owners of this land, their elders past and present. Let me acknowledge the elders amongst us, particularly John Moanjul, from whom we've just heard, his elders past and present, and those of every Indigenous person in this space. I'd obviously also want to acknowledge, if I could, the Paddy Jappaljari Sims as one of the 5 men amongst the 20-plus women who made this work that's in the collection of Kluge-Ruhe. Paddy was kind enough to introduce me to some knowledge about Karakur when I visited the site in 1993. Some knowledge about it. And was kind enough to name me Chungarai in his at his will, and it's something I've tried to live up to, but failed to live up to for many years. So I acknowledge him as well. I also thank, of course, Margot. Where's Margot? There she is. The wonderful director of this place that is unique in the world as a centre, for thinking about Indigenous Australian art. And I acknowledge my academic son. Who could not be proud of someone like Henry Skerritt? My God, fantastic. So all those acknowledgements are done. My theme is I'm trying to work on what Henry asked me to deal with, which was the impacts of Indigenous Australian art on contemporary art history. And I think we can immediately see that there are a number of impacts. And I'd just like to spend these few minutes giving you examples of how Indigenous art has in fact challenged the practice of art history in important ways. Not just the practice of museum curation, which has been bagged a little bit this morning, art museum curation, but the art historical narratives that underlie it and the practice of art historians such as myself. So obviously there were questions such as, you know, is this stuff art at all? Where's the pointer? Somewhere here. Doesn't matter. You can read them. That kind of question's obviously been totally swamped and disappeared. If people are still asking that question, they should try to live in another century or move out of our time. Is it an Australian art? That's still a question of some interest. Is it now, or was it ever, modern art? And more recently, are the more recent manifestations a kind of contemporary art? So there are obviously questions that non-Indigenous people would ask. It may be interesting also, and this is something Henry has really obliged me to think about, maybe there are Indigenous art historical questions. Art history doesn't belong to Westerners. Indigenous people can ask art historical questions. They can ask about how, whether our art has historical aspects amongst its many other major purposes of manifesting spiritual power, giving information, continuing the traditions, educating the young ones, and so on and so forth. Does it also have historical aspects? And how important is history relative to others, and so on? And it would be wonderful if we could, like Henry said, reach a point where we were sharing historical questions. We're asking them together rather than from inside out of our different cultures. So let me first give some sort of answers to the first one. Is the Australian? And like everyone else, I'll just briefly show you something that's very personal. These are the only two works of art that were in my house when I was a young man. They weren't the actual works of art, of course, but the reproductions. In our house, we only had reproductions. The one on the left was over the mantelpiece in the living room. My mother absolutely loved this image. It was probably the most popular image in the world. In fact, it's been measured as being the most popular reproduced image throughout the world in the 1950s. And similarly, of course, within Australia, works such as this by Evelyn A were extremely popular. That was in the hallway. Actually, it was part of a calendar. So that was a slight difference. But these are the only two images in my house when I was very young. This image on the left evoked the strangeness of art, the bizarreness of it, the exotic character that art could introduce to you. For me, the image on the right evoked just what I thought about Australia. I knew that Albert Namatjira was an Indigenous man, but that was not a big fact about it. Works such as this were just Australian paintings. They weren't distinctly Indigenous in character. And they were not so much different from Arthur Streeton, whose works were also produced. And clearly, this is Australian art. If that's not Australian art, what in the hell is? Okay. So, but obviously at that point, this is before I'm 9 years old at this point, so it's before distinctions of the kind that art historians ask were even being posed. Now, clearly, there are many different approaches to showing Indigenous art in Australian museums, and many of them obviously occurred before the Dreaming show. We have all Tony Tuxton's great curating at the Art Gallery of New South Wales that gradually brought Indigenous art from the basement up through the building where it now is very, very prominent. We have Australian Perspective, curated by Bernice Murphy in 1981, where she hung these works basically next to each other in one part of the show. And John just reminded me that in a Biennale shortly thereafter, there was a performance painting, a sound painting done, also in the middle of the Art Gallery of New South Wales. Now, John himself, as a very young curator, was beginning to do his curatorial work for the Power Institute, for the Power Gallery, where I worked and where Bernice and Leon Perossian were the curators. This kind of juxtaposition shows us that at this particular point, David is looking at Indigenous art, as it were, from outside. He hasn't really absorbed what he's looking at. But he did persist in looking, and looking at works such as the great Aboriginal, so-called Aboriginal Memorial, and produce works that tried to actually become a kind of equivalent practice by a non-Indigenous man, an Englishman, painting in a way that was also an Australian art that brought the two cultures together, at least on the surface of this particular painting. So that's one kind of thing that was occurring, and I think it's really important. Another thing that was occurring at the same time, even before Dreamings, was a split within the Australian art world between different tendencies. And the whole postmodern tendency that dominated during the 1980s, the idea of making art out of appropriations of art from many different cultures, particularly the dominant European international art forms, that was taken up to the extent that for most non-Indigenous Australian artists, the most radical and critical and creative practice that you could follow during the 1980s was not to originate an art from your own traditions, but actually appropriate art from everywhere else. And this is an example of Juan de Villa, who famously got terribly angry in an exhibition in Paris in 1983 called Australian Art, the Dream and the Real. He got very angry at all the attention paid to Indigenous artists and the almost total lack of attention paid to non-Indigenous artists in that show. So in a certain sense, he's saying the history of Australian art is a confection, and it's a kind of weird confection of elements from artists from overseas, both gay artists like Tom of Finland, the trans avant-garde artists like Kuchi and so on, Peter Booth, Australian artist, Liechtenstein in the background, etc., etc. Everything in that sense is a confection of differences. That's all that's possible. In that sort of framework, the sort of dynamics that we're looking at today had a tough time surviving, except it's important to register that they were picked up in some of the books that were written at that time, including the sort of updating of Australian painting that I did at Bernard Smith's behest. He asked me to write the chapters that brought the history of Australian painting up from the 1970s up to the present. At that point, it was 1990. And of course, I said, I've got to do a couple of major things that you did not do. For example, write about women artists. He wrote about 2 women artists in the whole history up until that point. And of course, write about the clear movement, the great movement of Indigenous Australian art. His argument had been, of course, that that's for the anthropologists. He explicitly said that. He changed his mind during this period and famously created a fund to support the Aboriginal arts, but his early position was a very conventional, separate the disciplines position. So he asked me to do that, and he also asked me to make suggestions for the front and back cover of the book. Front and back covers are important in books like this that are going to be textbooks. The front cover introduces to the main theme. The back cover takes you up and brings you into the present. In this case, we have Arthur Boyd's wonderful picture called The Scapegoat, which is his anti-Anzac, anti-Gallipoli, Australian ultra-nationalist painting. So we put an anti-nationalist painting on the front cover of the book. But we also put on the back a painting I'd literally just seen on a quick visit to Brisbane in a sort of temporary exhibition in some business centre, which absolutely stunned me when I saw it. Of course, this great work, Jump Up White Fellow, The Nine Ricochets, Gordon Bennett's great parody of Iman Stiller's effort to appropriate him. So here we see Indigenous artists reappropriating the appropriators, turning appropriation back upon the artists who are just using their imagery as one amongst other sorts of images that was going on. This is a very dense and I think powerful connection that's operating between artists. And it continues in the way artists such as Richard Bell, in fact, parody even this whole process. So, of course, paintings such as the one on the left is very well known, his theorem of equivalence that also sends up a theory by Iman Stiller's that everything is connected with everything else, so it's all the same really, anything goes. He's saying that's a kind of nonsense. The whole construction of Aboriginal art is a white thing, he says. Of course, a few years later, he says the opposite. And that's typical Richard Bell. Australian art is an Aboriginal thing. That's the kind of energies that we're working on and dealing with here. So the dynamics, and these occur around the period, of course, of dreamings that occurs in the middle of these developments. So it's already a very dense discourse happening in Australia, Australian art, curating and history writing and thinking. The second sort of question I asked was the question, is Indigenous Australian art a modern art? Again, it's an absurd question, and it's really been answered very strongly, and it's important because art historians begin with these massive categories, which they then work inside and kind of recomplicate. And it's usually underneath it all is the assumption that the social, political, cultural organisation, economic organisation of a society generates certain kinds of art practices that work off it and not just reflect it, but shape it and change it and are shaped by it. And there's the ones that we have in a standard orthodox schema. But people like Ian has argued most recently and very powerfully that the whole history of Indigenous art practice in Australia has been a practice of modernising. It's been a practice of not only continuing traditions, but also constantly adjusting to these invasive modernisers that have come to the country. He calls them modernist. I think that goes a little far, but modernising does make some sense. I'm happy to talk about that distinction in our discussion if you wish. And his front and back cover are also extremely interesting because he kind of repeats, he refers to a practice that is clearly grounded in tradition, but was very powerfully present in the early Whakapanya years. And then a Gordon Bennett work which uses the Aboriginal colours, but as he said, it could have been painted by anybody almost at any period about almost anything. It could have been done by Malevich if he had any Indigenous aspects to his ancestry. So I think the argument about being modern or not it's over. It's clearly done. That one we don't have to worry about. Contemporary is another and more interesting question, I think. Is Indigenous Australian Aboriginal art contemporary? How has it been contemporary? How has it been seen to be contemporary in different places in different parts of the world? This is, of course, the classic image about magicians de la terre. It's the first one you'll find if you Google magicians de la terre. And a lot's been said about it. The Uenda ground painting against the work by Richard Long. The whole exhibition was really not just about art from Europe and art from the rest of the world. It was about European artists who had spiritualist and primitivist fantasies about art, their work juxtaposed with the kind of artists they were having primitivist fantasies about. It was a kind of dynamic of doubling in that sense, 50-50 each, right throughout the show. And then the curator says, let's see what happens. What happened, many things happened, and one of the things happened that's really quite interesting that came up by sheer chance of the juxtaposition of these two exhibitions in New York in September, October 2015, was that literally in two galleries on the Bowery, just south of Houston, in buildings three or four houses away from each other, these two artists happened to be showing at the same time. On the left, Richard Long is doing yet another version of his mud circle. He's been doing them for years and years and years and years and years. So we have a sense of what I call remodernism, or modernism repeating itself, modernism on repetition mode. And we have here, of course, an artist who, yes, is an artist who actually totally renovating his art year after year after year since the early 80s when he came to join communities around Papunya and in that area. He and Yukaji, his niece or sister, I can't remember the relationship, the kind of art they're producing is really staggering work that it becomes more and more, in the views of many people, a kind of refined abstraction of a sort that the New York critics just totally fell over about and utterly failed to find the words to describe, as distinct from Henry, who introduced it very well on the website for this exhibition. So we've got a switching of energies, a switching of where the inventive power is between repetition by a great late modern artist and constant innovation by a great contemporary Indigenous artist. Okay, now curators are reacting to this. Curators around the world are realizing that we've got to include this work in our major survey shows. There are many ways of doing it. Putting it in a workplace show such as Documenta in a single space with a couple of really wonderful artists, that's one way of doing it. More interesting way of doing it is to include works by Indigenous artists when you are exploring a particular theme in one section of an exhibition that is exploratory in itself. This is a space in which Oak Green Waisor wanted to examine the way in which various women artists in particular have imagined entire worlds, entire futures. And that's in fact what's happening in the work of Ellen Gallagher on the paintings on the side, where she imagines a kind of black African-American Atlantic domain. And here, of course, Emily Ngwari, her great picture of the Earth creation, everything being created. And Huma Baba, her series of atlas figures, which are about great creative figures that are involved in a certain form of self-destruction. So three incredibly powerful women artists working on a very important theme have been brought together. So that's I think, important. And that to me is the stronger curatorial response than simply representing work in a fairly orthodox fashion. Very quickly, contemporaneity in our art practice is not just about lots of things occurring together or being different at the same time. There are actually currents within world contemporary art. And the currents are to do with transforming late modern art, dominantly in Europe and America, in very obvious ways. Since the 60s, however, there have been absolutely major transformations occurring around the world that have changed the idea of national arts. They've made them transitional. They've put nations into a transnational situation. Lots of exchanges between them back and forward. And in many cases, these have been led by Indigenous artists in their countries. In Australia, in a certain way, more than any other country, Indigenous artists have led this transformation in the way we think about the art of our nation and our culture and of our region. Many contemporary artists of all kinds now focus on the 3 or 4 elements I've just mentioned down below. I can't go into details about it. If you're interested, check this book out. That's the 2 editions of my book. It's a textbook used worldwide. The reason for the fact the covers are different is that one of the covers is the English edition, which covers all the original English Empire places, and the other cover is the American edition. You have to guess which is which. Okay, now, world picturing is something that artists all over the world do. Here's an example of some really wonderful ecologically focused artists who world picture. In this case, they're imagining Europe as a kind of lynx, as a creature that walks through water, that lives through different kinds of water. So almost a kind of indigenous sense of Europe. Here is another way of thinking about the universe, this deeply indigenous way of approaching the idea of imagining universes. In this case, imagining not just the stars and the firmament, but the creation of points of energy, of all kinds of creativity around the world. We have, in the work of certain indigenous artists, a richness of imagination, extraordinary depth of being able to visualize something incredibly complex that is very hard to find matching equivalent power in the work of many other artists in other parts of the world, particularly those working in modern traditions. But there is more and more of it coming. So that's, in a sense, a way of thinking about the world more generally. A further sense that's important is, and again, I acknowledge Henry here, I'm coming now to my question about Indigenous artists thinking historically, and I'll just finish with a couple of points about how I think this is occurring. One way is to, I've got 5, great. One way is to actually acknowledge and look at the work of artists such as Gabriel Marangura here, who literally looks back into recorded history of his own people and his own people's experiences and paints history paintings from the past, imagining the past. And here's a very clear example of it. He's used resources such as photographs of Baldwin Spencer in this region to develop some of his imagery, but he's not appropriating the image or repainting the image or presenting this historical photograph again. He's really just reimagining the visit of Baldwin Spencer, the great anthropologist. He's reimagining him as one of the first art dealers, if you like, heading up into this region. And he's further reimagining him as someone who's a person of equivalent power, of equivalent character, of equivalent interest to an Indigenous man who he's meeting, who has this sort of double character, who can actually be the same person. They both have elements that they can share. They obviously are very different people in all sorts of ways, you can work it out, but they actually are reaching together to share something. So there's an idea of difference here, that, as Henry pointed out, difference and different kinds of difference are definitive of our contemporaneity, but there are also here, there are parallel histories, and there may in fact be the possibilities of what I would call coeval convergences as well. And that's the last point I'll try and bring out. This is this is clearly a historical work. It thinks back through the 200 years of Australian history as from the point of view of white people as an invasion. It also sees this invasion as a place that the people in this region responded to by reasserting their own relationship to their land, creating a kind of beautiful landscape, a place of beauty to enter and a place where you could learn about this land. I always prefer the older installation to the newer one, and so on. So I prefer the older installation because you could actually get closer to it, but I totally prefer the original display of the work at the Bicentennial Biennale. Nicholas Waterloo allowed John and the painters to display it there on one of the piers in Sydney. Fantastic, unforgettable moment. So finally, ways of being contemporary. There's another way of being contemporary, and that is to react to what's happening in the present, react to it with the knowledge that you have and the critical perspectives that you have. And clearly, in this case, Gordon Bennett is reacting to 9/11. In a case like this, Turkey Tolson. And here's something really strange and to me powerful. This is a print I bought just before I went to the States. So I arrived in the States on September the 10th, 2001. And I looked at the television and saw the buildings being hit and the people jumping out of them. And I had this print in my hand from Turkey Tolson, made before 9/11, about 2 sites. It's extraordinary. What's happening here? I don't know. This is there are temporalities that actually don't fit linear time. So this is a kind of, I don't know what it's to do with 9/11, but it has something to do with it in a crucial way. And finally, Tracy Moffat, reacting to the situation in Europe of refugee people, immigrant people, trying to come back to Europe and to be actually find places where they can live in this centre that seems to be so powerful and so well endowed and so on and so forth. Absolutely contemporary question. So just to summarise at the end, the answers are very clear. Of course, Indigenous Australian people produce art. They produce more than what we could simply call art. Clearly, it's Australian, it's deeply Australian. It's the oldest Australian. It has always been modern. It is contemporary in all the different ways I've just tried to show you. Aspects of it are historical. And this is, in a sense, the exchange to Balanda, the non-Indigenous people. We have to understand things historically, not just abstractly. And it's important for us to understand things historically. But it's also important to understand them together, to understand in terms of this coeval communality, which is what we need to build in this world. Otherwise, it's all over for all of us. So thank you.
Thank you, Terry. I'm slightly the Pacific outlier, if I can call it that. I should just pull you up. Do you want to come in? Oh, they're doing it? Oh, okay. Yeah, we're going to paddle to that part of the world, north and east of Australia now. And I hope we'll bring out some ideas about Indigenous art in general. So, tēnā koutou katoa. Tēnei te mihi ki ngā kaitiaki o tēnei whenua. Ngā mihi nui ki a koutou mō tō manaakitanga mō tō tautoko o te kaupapa o te rānei e. I acknowledge and pay my respects to the custodians of this land on which we gather today, to the current generations and their ancestors, those that have passed on and those yet to come. And thank you also to the Kluge-Ruhe for inviting me back here, for your warm hospitality. It's always a real pleasure to come back. And I thank you for being such impeccable hosts. Ko tainui te waka, ko rangiahua te maunga, ko awanui te awa, ko Ngai Tai te iwi, ko Maia Nuku aho. So I'm really delighted to have been invited to contribute to this dialogue reflecting upon the legacy of the landmark 1988 Dreamings show. On this one? It's clicked up there now. Oh, right. and to think in this session now about the role and agency of oceanic art within the context of my own curatorial work at the Met, because that's, I think, the easiest way for me to think about these issues that we're discussing, and to think also about its future potential within the broader context of global contemporary art. The collection at the Met includes art. Well, in New York, I look after a collection of over 2,000 works from the Pacific, ancestral treasures or heirlooms, taonga ngā that have been passed down through the generations, that come from islands and archipelagos spread across a vast expanse of ocean that takes up over a third of the globe. And the collection at the Met includes art from the very beginning of the Austronesian story, from Taiwan and the Philippines, Indonesia, and the islands of Southeast Asia, as well as monumental works from New Guinea, its regional and coastal provinces, and art from each of the major archipelagos located further to its east, Micronesia to its north, and the many islands of Polynesia at its furthest extremities. I also look after the Australian Aboriginal collections, so it's a vast tranche of the world. It's a complex and kaleidoscopic, let's say, collection. Ideas and philosophies pertaining to the water penetrate not only the diverse physical landscape of the region, from the rivers and swamps of dense rainforest to the tranquil lagoons which encircle coral atolls, they are also instantiated in the metaphysical waterways which announce ancestral arrivals, the departure of the dead, and the potent watery underworld of Pulotu, ancestral homelands inhabited by the spirits of deceased ancestors. It was the Tongan scholar Epeli Hawofa who argued for a revision of the way in which we perceive the region. In his oft-cited work, Our Sea of Islands, he pointed out that people from outside the region have generally represented the Pacific as a region of tiny islands, mutually isolated in a huge ocean, each individual nation too small to escape a cycle of dependency. The term Pacific Islands, he wrote, conjures up an idea of scattered units of land surfacing atop a submerged spine of reefs or seamounts. Yet, he argues, it is this same ocean that sustains and connects us. The world of our ancestors, he wrote, was a large sea full of places to explore, for people to make homes in, to breed new generations of seafarers. People raised in this environment were at home in the sea. They developed great skills for navigating their waters and the spirit to traverse the large gaps that separated their island groups. He suggested it was time to adopt a more affirmative understanding of the region, one, he insisted, that emerges from Pacific peoples' own understandings of the relationships that exist between them. These relationships, he pointed out, are long-standing, cultural, linguistic, genealogical, born of the sheer cosmopolitanism of the region, from centuries of migration, travel, dynamic trade, and exchange. So one of the challenges of helping to make these cultures relevant to local and international audiences in New York is how to present examples of the rich and varied art forms of the region without falling into a geography lesson of complex gallery maps and culture groups. So as well as honing in on the marvelous and specific details of individual works, it really falls upon us to outline a far broader thematic about the role and agency of art from the region. And I would say that the interconnectedness of it, of the region as a whole, and of its people in terms of ancestry, genealogy, and the centuries of dynamic engagement that I've spoken of, is really the strand that unites all of the art in the galleries that I look after at the Met. The idea of voyaging is, of course, not limited to literal voyaging across the open seas. Spiritual voyaging is also evoked in much of the sculptural arts of the region, which was often a means to stage a necessary journey into another realm, from life to death, for example, with sculptures the focal point of formal protocols that assist in this transition across perceived thresholds in the ritual and cosmological landscape. Storytelling is the other great connector that can help us get to grips with the complexity of interpreting the arts of Oceania. For all the arts are a vital means to access a story. And we've seen that today already in the case studies that we've been thinking about and talking about. customary knowledge, oral traditions, the constantly proliferating landscape of genealogical relationships. All these fundamental aspects of the culture were and continue to be channeled via the vehicle of art, as a means by which a current generation might pass important knowledge on to the next. Acting as mnemonics to memory, this art, activated with song and dance, chants, words, and gesture, can revive the past and bring it hurtling back into the present, into the now. And I show here a detail of our Cuomo ceiling, an iconic installation in the Principal Oceania Gallery at the museum. It's an evocation of the roof of a men's ceremonial house, comprising over 280 commissioned painted palm spathe panels from artists in Mariwai village in the Washcook Hills in the Middle Sepik River region of Papua New Guinea. And at 24.5 meters end to end, it's the largest contemporary art installation in the Met. So one of the challenges of looking after a collection of art is the static nature of display. How do we convey to visitors the vital components of artworks when so much of the sensual repertoire of words and gesture originally conceived to accompany it, or indeed in the making of it, is now absent? When I arrived in New York to take up the position, I was keen to work with Pacific artists as a way to animate the galleries and to populate the space with Pacific voices. And I had wondered about the institutional memory of the museum with regard to Te Māori, the landmark exhibition that the Met hosted in 1984, of course just 4 years before the Dreamings exhibition at the Asia Society. The exhibition was conceived by Douglas Newton, the first curator in charge of the Department of the Arts of Africa, Oceania, and the Americas, which I now work in, and Hirini Moko Mead, the Maori scholar, as a project that would showcase the finest examples of Maori art from New Zealand collections on an international stage in New York. This exhibition has come to be understood as a significant milestone in the cultural renaissance of Maori, a turning point, if you will, in the way in which museums and communities interacted around art from then on in the region. And I thought it would be appropriate to touch on this exhibition now, to add some further coordinates to this overall landscape of exhibition making that's going on in New York during this era, the mid to late 80s, as a way of thinking about the way these exhibitions were beginning to transform the institutions that hosted them. And just to remind that the Rockefeller Wing, which houses the arts of Oceania, along with that of Africa and the ancient Americas, had opened just 2 years earlier in 1982 to a specially constructed wing in the building. Nelson Rockefeller had, in fact, announced in May 1969 his decision to gift the entire collection of the Museum of Primitive Art, as it was then known, to the Metropolitan Museum after almost 40 years of advocating to trustees for the inclusion of these important non-Western art forms as they were then defined. So in a single stroke, the landscape of the Metropolitan changed forever. And this is the moment still acknowledged by the museum as when the Metropolitan became truly encyclopedic, when it shepherded in works from what is essentially the global south. So I'll now, could you help me just pull up the, oh yeah, I think I'm gonna do it. Oh, yeah, great. So we're going to just see some footage from the opening of Te Māori, September 10th, 1984. Can they put it back on? To the PowerPoint, yeah, sorry. Could we go back to the PowerPoint, please? Thank you. 11 is the number. Thank you. So with the traffic stopped on Fifth Avenue, a large group of visitors gathered on the front steps of the museum in the early hours of the morning. Mr. Sani Waru of the Taranaki tribes, seen here carrying his tokotoko or walking stick, began the ritual chants. The group is flanked by Jerry Rautangata on the left side and Dr. Peter Sharples of Ngāti Kahungunu. Armed with taiaha, they flanked the group of kaumatua or elders as they proceeded to enter into the museum and move through the galleries. Also in the group are the ambassador for New Zealand in Washington and his wife, both curators, Douglas Newton and Hiranimoko Mead, as well as executive members of the Maori Management Committee, Hamu Mitchell, Piri Shasha, who had overseen many of the extensive negotiations with tribal groups back in New Zealand. Once inside the museum, ritual chants were led by Sir James Henare for the Northern Iwi or tribes, Ruka Broughton for the Ngāti Pōneke region, Monita Delamere for Mātātua, and Henare Tūwhangai performed the rituals in the exhibition area itself. So in this way, tribes from all four corners of New Zealand, Ngahoe Whā, or the four winds, were represented. And this is a shot from the final lineup, where the two mutually distinct parties of host and visitors come together and share breath or ho, signaling the coming together of the two halves into a whole and the end of the formal protocols. So the impact of this exhibition was far-reaching, and it's frequently cited as responsible for establishing an entirely new cultural framework of policy for museums in New Zealand. Not only did it change the overall perception of Maori culture, both abroad and at home, it forced a debate concerning issues surrounding the display and management of Maori collections of art and ethnography. In its process, the exhibition set new precedents in areas of consultation and shared decision-making. Maori tribal authorities had been consulted from the outset, and this was a significant development that attended to the rights of diverse parties in the interpretation and articulation of Maori cultural heritage and the way in which Maori were represented. Whilst curators were responsible for making the initial selection of loan requests, it was the New Zealand museums that insisted on full Maori participation from the outset, and full consultation with Maori tribal authorities and elders was sustained throughout. The New Zealand museum staff acknowledged their very special roles as custodians of taonga, ancestral treasures, on behalf of Maori, and were sensitive to the fact that despite their nominal legal relationship or ownership of Maori artifacts, let's say the physical aspect, full spiritual and cultural custodianship, let's say the metaphysical, rested with a wide variety of Maori tribal groups. And this was not merely token support. Important decisions in key areas were taken out of the hands of museum professionals. Much debate surrounded this particularly significant sculpture, which both the American curators and Maori were keen to include in the final section. So Maia Nuku is an incredibly rare early carving discovered in 1906 at Lake Ngaroto near Te Awamutu. And Maia Nuku is the kaitiaki or guardian deity for the Waikato people from the Tainui canoe. And this is the upper section of the post that remains. It's 1.67 meters in height. The guardianship of this carving is entrusted to one family. And at certain times, Ue Nuku is asked to manifest himself in the post so that he can be consulted by tohunga, ritual experts, who can consult the ancestral deity on behalf of the community. It was the conservators who deemed this piece too fragile to sustain the pressures of an international overseas exhibition. Yet contrary to their advice, and just a few days before the packing crates were due to be shipped to New York, a final decision was reached. And the Maori queen, Dame Te Ate Rangikahu, insisted in the final hour that their ancestral carving, Ue Nuku Tufatu, this iconic ancestral figure from the Waikato Tainui tribal authorities, would lead the exhibition of taonga into a foreign land, just as he had led their Maori tribe from Hawaii, the ancestral homelands in central Polynesia, to Aotearoa, New Zealand. So working now in New York with the Oceania collections at the Met, I often reflect on the legacy of Te Māori. The constant presence of Māori and their insistence on overseeing appropriate tikanga or protocols ensured that museum staff and audiences alike were introduced to this unique relationship of Māori with their art. That sculptures were not simply relics of a forgotten past, but very much living spiritual ancestors who remained in relation with their living descendants. And in this respect, the artworks were very much ambassadors, specifically charged by Māori elders to travel overseas to raise the profile of Māori culture, so that Māori art, in their eyes, could stand on the world stage to be appreciated alongside the art of the great civilizations of Greek and Rome, of China and Egypt, a canon expanded. So in the 3.5 decades since Te Māori, the scholarly disciplines that frame oceanic art have continued to shift steadily. Curators of Pacific art continue to work on the boundaries of many disciplines: art history, ethnography, anthropology, archaeology, and museology. We have many hats. And collaborative research projects that invite Pacific artists, scholars, cultural practitioners to work alongside museum curators and conservators in museum collections has really gathered momentum. Pooling these different knowledge bases, they bring new perspectives to the research, lessening this gap between knowledge and practice. Shifts in the academic landscape mean that written documents are no longer perceived as the only valid primary resources. The discourse of materiality has taken center stage to direct a discourse that acknowledges the active agency, the subjectivity, let's say, of objects, opening up pathways to different kinds of knowledge and understandings. And crucially, scholars in the academy have begun to take the new perspectives and viewpoints of these Pacific collaborators much more seriously. And this has impacted my own curatorial practice in the sense that I've moved towards an understanding of the gallery itself as a place of encounter, shifting the perception of it, the gallery space, as simply a place where we select and present art from a particular region. I prefer to approach it as a place to host in the manner that Pacific peoples are accustomed to do. And in this way, it becomes a very active, dynamic space, a place to dialogue, a place to confront complex colonial histories, a place to honor and explore indigenous epistemologies, and have these different ways of being fill the space of the gallery, and perhaps land and take root, witnessed by the public and, crucially, fellow colleagues in the museum. If we believe in the active agency of things, then the collections become much more than a static resource from which to draw periodically for the staging of temporary exhibits. Bringing people physically and digitally into the galleries helps connect the living dynamic with the collections to activate and enliven relationships. And I'll just finish quickly with mention of one recent project that not only ignited the Oceania collections, but also allowed a space to subvert the institutional hierarchies that are built into the very architecture of a place like the Met. And this is Rosanna Raymond, aka Sister Specific, who was in 2017 the Chester Dale Fellow in Education and Public Practice. And from the outset, she established that, as well as using her time to incubate ideas for various ongoing projects, Her interest was to respond in her own way to the institution of the museum itself. And we did a great project where she wanted to instantiate a character, Backhand Maiden, who is one of her characters, and decided that she wanted to move through the space of the museum. And she had brought her bark cloth frock, she calls it, her bark cloth dress. It was a very powerful morning where we moved through the space of the museum, and she really, the canon of art is really incarnated into the very architecture of the building. You know, you come up the front steps, you hang a right for Egypt, you go left to Greek and Roman, or you go up these central steps to the enlightened galleries of European sculpture and decorative arts. And so she has this dress, as she's curtsying to these, it was the kind of the strength of a female body, that contested site of encounter in 18th century Pacific, clothed in bark cloth, in the skin of trees, and actually moving through the Greek and Roman galleries, specifically with that sense of nudity and the idealized canon of beauty. And then when she curtsies gently, the back of her dress opens to reveal her tattooed, inscribed genealogical markings that she wears on her skin. So it was a very interesting and powerful way to unfold her own storied past into the present, introducing her own ancestors to those of ancient Rome and the rest of the museum. So just to finish, we all work within the particular parameters of our time, pushing against an institutional framework so that it nudges further in the direction that we believe it needs to go. As well as a repository of the past, collections are living resources for creative interventions. And these projects build on the original notion of the role of a curator, curare, in terms of taking care of and attending to the art, and move closer to that idea of guardianship, or kaitiakitanga, that sees us looking to reset relationships that have maybe become eclipsed over time. This work is cross-cultural and interdisciplinary. It can bridge the past with the present. For whilst the artworks are an inventory of our collective Pacific inheritance, they also constitute an archive that remains animate, relevant, and always ripe for reinterpretation. In this globalized era of hypermobility and consumption, when climate change threatens the very existence of many island nations, raising the profile of Oceania's uniquely eloquent arts has never seemed more pertinent. Indigenous art has always been used as a vehicle to express and channel knowledge and map ancestral connections. It is this agency, this efficacy, that ensures it will continue to play a pivotal role in extending the boundaries of conventional art histories. Our ancestors had the imagination to visualize and make tangible these deep, virtual networks of ancestral relations. They wrote these lines of lineage into their skin, plaited and painted them into masks, planted them into wood as notches in carving. This particular and distinctive way of being in the world, this unique conceptual landscape of the Pacific, all of this is embedded into each of the individual artworks we encounter in the galleries. Meshing their values, ideas, and philosophies into the surfaces and intricate folds of things, artists ensured that these would be revealed well into the future. The power of Pacific art is really unleashed when we encounter these works. The Pacific as it inheres in people and places and time, the Pacific of song and story as it is spoken and danced, the Pacific in art that is relational, in art that keeps moving, that can shift in and out of different worlds, as indeed it was designed originally to be. And the Pacific as it inheres in this ongoing, complex, and very tricky work of relationships between people, art, and museums, dynamic and ever-evolving. So thanks very much.
What another amazing session. Today has really been such a rich and enlivening day. So I'm about to throw open to all of you to ask questions, and I'd like you to kind of consider how we begin to sort of pull this corset of ideas together. And I'm going to start because at the very beginning of the day, Chris Anderson very rightly pointed out something that all of the Australians in the room know, which is that Australians love the validation of somewhere else, right? That when we talk about an exhibition like Dreamings, one of the things that we're looking at is the international validation of something that I think we all know is really great. And so I guess the question I have now is where to next? Because in many respects, the Indigenous Australian art movement, Indigenous art movement globally is really healthier than it's ever been. We see Indigenous artists included in the Venice Biennale, and Documenta, and the practices at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, but it still remains a small subsection of the world of contemporary art. How do we, curators, art historians, anthropologists, artists, break through that ceiling that people like yourself, John, have been battling against for 40 years. Terry's been writing about since 1974 at least. Where do we go from here?
You're asking me now.
I'll ask you, John.
Well, A, to start with, why do you want to be, as I said jokingly at some piece of writing, so Australians like to think we have the best sportsmen and we have the best tennis players, we have the best this and that, and of course we have the best Aborigines in the world. And it's sort of like that. It's I don't want to be a validation of someone else to start with. Why do you want to be the best Aborigine in the world? So that's a question to ask. I think all the in the movement forward of all this this upward climb to get Aboriginal art, Aboriginal people into, as we call it, Aboriginal. Everyone's Aboriginal. To get that into the picture, into the Australian picture, to get it into the world picture as a political position, really, so they can't just come and kill all of us or imprison all of us because we're known worldwide, or we're known, like you said, the person who came up and said, or Chris was saying, the woman who jumped up and said, oh, you're Michael Nelson Giacomo, type of thing. We did, in another exhibition I did in New York, these people, we were at a bank trying to get money out of a bank and by a key card, that is, not with a gun. And this African-American women came around the corner and they said, oh, and they looked and then they said, oh, you're those Aborigines, aren't you? So they knew there were these foreign people here. So all I can do is, we say there's hope and was a time of, not hope, what was the word? A positive, well, we are aspirational, but...
Aspirational.
Aspirational, that's it. But I think Chris also said it was a positive time. There's a lot of positive, there's optimism, that's the word, thank you. The O word, optimism around. Now, I've never ever felt that there hasn't been an optimism around anywhere. I think if you want to keep doing things, as an Aboriginal person, I want to keep telling stories. I want to keep making art. I want to enjoy myself, and I haven't felt particularly that that's stopped. I still feel positive. What they say, there's two things that those people on Okinawa that grow to 120 years old, there's 10 things that they do, and that's why they're still alive at 120. And two of those things are they have a drink every day. Was one of those things that they found in their diet that I could agree with, and they have a positive view on life. And you have to have a positive view that you're going to do something. I can't tell you what it's going to be, and things will happen that you don't have control over, but that as they tumble into being, you just got to enjoy it when they do. Mm-hmm. And I think the only thing to do to retain that positivity is to keep practicing. I tell all the next generation of Aboriginal artists and curators especially, just practice at your craft. You know, your craft is to be a curator, or you want to be a curator, well, practice at it constantly, because otherwise, when the moment arrives to do something publicly, you'll be hitting the wrong note, or you'll go off key, or you won't know. You'll make these clumsy steps. So just to keep practicing, do the things that you like, and that can give you the enjoyment to go forward. I can't tell you what the form is of that. Once upon a time I thought there was going to be a big boom in Australia in Aboriginal filmmaking. So there have been filmmakers that have come into being. People in Arnhem Land and other places now, and certainly in the desert, are making their own films. They don't need George Miller to fund them or anything else. They're just starting to make their own films. And I thought that would be the next stage of development. At Yirrkala, they're making their own films as well. And at Remenginning, it's almost, we've had about 4 major films made at Remenginning or nearby. And people there also make their own films now.
Did you want to respond to that, Maia? I saw you nodding along.
Well, as you were taking your flow, I was thinking when you said just keep doing what you're doing, and I think there's a certain power to being at one end of the building and like pushing productively against an institutional framework. You know, that's quite
well, there is that
energizing
thing,
in a way. You know, if you and also I think the lens. I always think of it as like this institutional access. It does feel like it's shifting. But I just think if we just do what is appropriate for us to do in our galleries and display the works as we feel it is appropriate for us to do, people are kind of noticing that. And I think they see that the art that we're, that in, say, the Oceanic Art has a different kind of vibration to it.
Life to it,
And I've had colleagues, say that's great. You can get the Hawaiian community come in and they want to chant to their ancestral treasures and they want to respond to the collections in the way, and so in a sense, that's a uniqueness to the art, and so we could celebrate that. I don't think in such a museum like the Met that's so encyclopedic in a way you couldn't have that happen throughout, but the institutional authority of the kind of voice of the museum is wanting to tell a much more connected global story and dialogue, and so that is changing. But I mean, I wouldn't necessarily want it to happen throughout the building. It's quite nice to just be this little fire burning in one corner of it. But I mean, I think the democratization, the multivocality, the different perspectives, the different trajectories of work into collections in different parts of the building, those are remits that are coming down from leadership now that they're wanting to see, so that our visitors have a much more nuanced, complex understanding of all the stories that are contained in the building.
So, Henry, I think your premise is wrong, and so is Chris's, in the sense that it may have been right for the time, but if you're having to compete in one country or one city or one region against the entire rest of the world, you will lose. Of course you will lose. We only occasionally win. We win in sports and so on and so forth. But you're setting up a competition that is absolutely impossible. So I think the framework is one that echoes previous structures of power against which we've all had to fight, and that's accurate. So it comes from the right place, but the way, if it's framed in a too general a fashion, it's destined to totally fail. So, and that's true for every country, for every person, every other country, except the absolute main centres of power where they don't care. So, and most issues to do with our contemporaneity and contemporary art in particular, we're in a contested field. So the Australian National Gallery must always show the Aboriginal Memorial as the first work you see when you go into the gallery. That is indigenising at least the entrance to the gallery. That's the deal. That's unique as far as I know. So that's, you know, things like that can be done. Mm-hmm. Everything's a contest. So, like, everything to do with contemporary art has three answers. The first one is that dominant Euro-American, modernist, official, high culture, incredibly expensive, 1% approach to contemporary art will never accept the art and the culture of poor people, colonised people, etc., except as aesthetic objects of a certain kind. Within it, they just won't accept the ground from which the material comes. There's a huge tradition of secularisation in Western cultures. The biggest function of museums, if we think about it from a distance, over the past 200 or 300 years has been to take the objects from the aristocrats and make them available to the people, take them from the churches and put them in museums, desecularize them, declass them. So that's been a big trajectory. What's happened in terms of the second answer, what I call the transnationality, perspectives from Africa, from Australia, New Zealand, from parts of Asia and South America, from the so-called South, have changed the world, they've shifted the world. It's going to take a couple of hundred years to really move it, and you're right. It starts from one part and slowly moves the institution. So I think there's what I call an iconogeographical turning of all our major institutions, but it's slow and it's broken, and it will be resisted time and time again. And there's a third current. There's a current of perspectives of a generation of yours, much younger than me, who have inherited this conflict of cultures, perspectives and politics from the modern era and modern period, and are actually looking for ways of connecting with each other, not just on the net and so on, but connecting according to values that hopefully will not collapse back into these. So the third answer is one in which we start to see Indigenous artists and non-Indigenous artists operating to create different values, new sets of values. Other ones are still active in the critical answers of the first, the second current, but most Indigenous artists are in fact excluded from the first current. So it's a complex answer. The world is complex.
In a way, though, the most optimistic thing I think we've heard all day. So you know, I think I think we've got to match the 6 currents and the 3 currents up sometime later tonight over a glass of wine.
6 currents.
Now, questions from the audience. Chris.
That's not what you think, Chair.
Oh, damn.
We've talked a lot about the dichotomy, false or otherwise, fine art, anthropology, and so on, but we haven't really talked about the sacred versus the secular. Right. And I'm interested. You know, I had many years of involvement with repatriation programs in Australia, and in a way, that's how I got dragged into the art scene, because the men in particular that I was working with in the Central Desert were the custodians on the male side of sacred objects. They also happened to be the key painters in the community. And I'm interested, Maia, in the whole issue of repatriation. On the one hand, where are there Maori attempts to bring things from your collection back home? And secondly, do you have a link with Te Papa, the National Museum of New Zealand? And you know, have you guys cooperated on anything? So just that twofold thing about, we haven't mentioned, I mean, for most of Aboriginal art, you can't really make a distinction between sacred and secular, because lurking underneath it all, the meaning, many depths of meaning that aren't even apparent to most people. So it's sacred in that sense, but then it's public as well, the twofold things. And then the second point is just about the repatriation, and has that been an issue for Maoridom with your institution, and Te Papa as well?
Okay, well, I'll answer the second part first. The Te Papa Tongarewa National Museum of New Zealand came out as an institution after the return of Te Māori to New Zealand after the 3 venues, after the 4 venues in the States. St. Louis, Chicago was added, and San Francisco. Then it went back as a new show, Te Hokinga Mai, where Māori decided that because the fiberwork arts, the cloaks, the kakahu, and the women's work wasn't included, that they would expand the show. And actually 38%, I think, of the population turned out to see that. And at the end of the tour around New Zealand institutions, they had a symposium in Wellington, and the new museum, Te Papa, was conceived out of that. And they began to think about ways that they could create a legacy. And so the training of Māori conservators, Māori curators, and a new vision for an institution. And so, yes, when I arrived to the museum, I was talking with Kaihotu Māori, the director, leadership of the museum, about ways that we could revitalize that link really between the 2 institutions, and have exchange groups, because they have a Te Māori Legacy Fund, actually. And so that's one thing that I am really keen to do, is change this. You know, we can't necessarily acquire works of art, major monumental works of Māori art, for the collection, but I think what I'm trying to do is kind of think about and explain to leadership how long-term loans and those kind of reciprocal relationships would be as valuable in terms of them lending us work. I mean, actually, the Māori collection at the Met is really quite, is very small. So most of those, it was a showcase of New Zealand collections of Māori art. And in terms of repatriation, no, there haven't been requests for works that are in our collection. I mean, I work closely with those groups. It's really about discussing case-by-case issues for that. And there's such a plethora of responses, you know, not just from Māori, but across the Pacific. Some people's, I hosted some artists from New Ireland and New Hanover who were thrilled that their Malangang and mortuary sculpture is on display in the museum. Because they have I mean, to my mind, you kind of create a piece of the whenua, the land, the island, in New York, and then those communities have a relationship with that art still. That's the genius of those works of art traveling and being cited in institutions around the world, because that's a network that Pacific people have no problem animating and revitalizing in a way, and that's that ambassadorial argument for these works, to keep moving. And that's the thing that Pacific people will say is perhaps, it's great that they're there, but can they keep moving? So that's maybe how we should think about the collections, as much more mobile and not kind of stuck now in a museum that wants to just hold on to them or acquire new ones and grow the collection. That acquisitiveness, I think, is the issue. So if we could relinquish our kind of commitment to that and just have institutions share and move the works, I think then that's just the way, you know, you want to keep revitalizing the story for a new generation. So that's what I think we should do.
Yeah, but, sorry,
It's a long answer.
it's a really important point, because the, so as I was hinting in a very schematic way about the de-aristocrat, revolutionary and secularizing roles of museums in particularly Western settings, that obviously doesn't apply. I mean, that's a deep root. But what happens, of course, is that those museums get turned into temples for art, temples for aestheticization, temples for the power of the previously rich and the currently wealthy. So that all kind of continues. But you're absolutely right. What that doesn't do, however, is destroy the power and the agency of individual works of art that have been created by artists who often worked against those grains and have produced works that, virtually all the so-called masterpieces that we keep going back to, we haven't got a mistress piece idea yet, but the works that are called masterpieces are works that are constantly reinterpreted generation after generation because they're against the grain of their time, and they have a certain depth and subtlety. This operates for Indigenous art and non-Indigenous art. It's for all sorts of art everywhere. So I'm totally for museums because museums are one of the few places, apart from universities, that actually collect ideas for how to survive in the future, right? They collect examples of how complex and subtle, layered and really deeply suggestive ways of being in the world have been concentrated in particular works of art and particular practices at certain times, and they're repositories that we're going to need when the institutions, collapse and the great world order that dominates now no longer dominates,
We're getting even more optimistic, aren't we? Great, John.
That's it's almost like I planted Terry there. That's a spectacular segue to the question that I wanted to ask, which is the question about, I think, the courage that we need in Australia to do something genuinely different, and that we might be on the precipice of doing. And so much of the dialogue around the last day or two has been about, about dreamings and about how it worked against perhaps ideas of art and prejudices about other cultures and self-critique in Australia and the way that we think about Australianness, both here and overseas, or there and overseas. Maia, you're talking about working against, in some way, some of the values and structures of the institutions that, that you have to curate within. And, you curate that institution in the ways that you tell stories, and generation by generation, everyone starts at a slightly better place than where we started, and the students that are working with the Kluge-Ruhe are starting at a much better place than most of us started. So my question, in lieu of all of that dialogue around working against structures, working against power, working against prejudice, is what would each of you do? What would be the lesson from all of this if you had an opportunity to create a different kind of cultural institution? If you were able to start now, how would we take these lessons as foundation stones for example, hypothetically, a National Museum of Aboriginal Art and Culture in Australia?
Or a similar venture in Charlottesville.
Or a similar venture, perhaps a sister institution in Charlottesville that could be co-funded.
These are all hypotheticals.
Hypothetical questions to any billionaires in the audience. But that's a serious question.
Yeah.
But it's like, if we're going to have these symposiums and if we're going to talk about these issues, we have to move things along. This has to do something. Can't just be talking. And so if you did have the opportunity to feed into that process, what would be the thing from each of your experience that you'd want to see in a new kind of institution?
Well, I was just thinking about all of that, obviously. But when Aboriginal people generally travel, we talked about binaries, people would demand to travel with a companion or have someone, and part of that was witnessing, so that if the main character was travelling, someone else would witness what they did. and report back to the community, no, this is what happened, this is what these people said. And so it's really funny that this is a discussion about Aboriginal things, and again, I've been in this position a few times. So there's two Aboriginal people in the room, John and I, Balang. So it's just an interesting thing, a comment, that's all to make. The other thing was when I said, somebody said the other day, I was talking about our Prime Minister or something, the definition of insanity is just keep doing the same thing over and over again and you'll get and expecting you'll get a different result, which is sort of obviously against some other general Stoic philosophies of just keep, keep putting one foot in front of the other. What I meant by that really was to keep doing things what I meant by that is to keep churning out your ideas and bringing them into practice, bringing them into being. And those ideas are how you change a different view on Aboriginal art practice or cultural practice, or it's not necessarily a new technology, it's not necessarily a new art style or whatever. It's more about an idea that's been unexposed, hasn't been revealed to the world, that is contained within Aboriginal cultural life or in a form of acting, a form of being. And that's what I think is the difference with to Maori, was that approach of opening it in that form at dawn, and a mass group of people who come and they chant. They don't come and make speeches about like thank General Electric and whatever. They came and they chanted, and I like the idea that these places are like embassies. A long time ago I described sacred places are like embassies. They become that place. They become parts of New Zealand or whatever. I think about 2 Biennales of Sydney ago, the director called her whole Biennale of Sydney was about embassies. She called all these sites where she placed the artworks around the city as embassies. But they were embassies of memory, embassies of sorrow, or something like this. So I like that idea, but what I meant was that keep doing what you're doing, and I meant that everyone's... No. No, we've already done that. But that's why we're here. No, to keep churning these ideas, playing with these ideas and your thoughts out, not just repeating the same thing, because that's if you keep repeating the same thing, well, that's insanity. And you're not going to change anyone's opinion. You're not going to change.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the model for me would be a model or a framework that allowed for that refreshing reinterpretation, mobility, moving the works or bringing the people in. So because, when you pull up and think about what it is that the artworks do and the agency and efficacy they have, you want to create a space where, because that's what you're conveying to the audience, what's unique about the work, that you can just dial up the past in the now. So they learn about time then, Indigenous time. We're not linear, we'll just call them in now and start chanting to them. So when you say when you invite people in the place and the space and they just do that, is the best way to show people what's embedded, what the art's designed to do, vehicle. And so if we could conceive a space to do that, and have that refined all the time, it would be great. I mean, at the College Arts Association...
I was just thinking about that myself.
He said, you can embellish, but he said, you asked him what role do the barks have in the Kluge-Ruhe, or he said they are meant to be looked at again and reinterpreted now by us.
And
And then next generation or next week or 100 years, they will need to be looked at. Their codes of conduct, they're about the duties and responsibilities and obligations. They're mnemonic to the past, the knowledge, the memory, the future. So if we could create a space where we can honour the ontological framework in which they were made now in the museum, that would be perfect.
But you know, that was a very powerful moment. So just to kind of give the backdrop, we hosted two artists here last week, I think, Goenbi Ganambar and Brewa Munungur, who have been working on a collaborative curatorial project with us. And we presented on the project at CAA, and going into the project, going into the Skype, the arts coordinator from Bukulange was explaining it's a conference, it's all these academics. And Will went in and he said, you know, conference means nothing to these guys. They're not going to be, you know, it's just talking work. And we presented on the project, and a conversation like this ensued afterwards. And Maia raised this idea after Goenbi had said that the paintings needed to be activated, that could be a form of ceremony. That the exhibition could be a form of ceremony. Later in the same day, we were opening an exhibition in Reno, and Goenbi we were all about to go on stage for a panel discussion, and Goenbi and Brewa were performing the Manake, the ceremonial songs, and he turned to us and he said, you know, it's like that Mialk said, it's like that lady said, this exhibition is ceremony, and as a result he said, everyone on the panel needs to be painted up. You can't all, and so there's three lily white guys with their suits on all getting painted up, because he had taken on board this idea that was his idea, but in the space of dialogue had opened up a series of new possibilities. And that to me is what any institution, whatever work they're wanting to do, needs to be doing. It's opening that possibility where people's ideas are given the fullness of their articulation, they're taken seriously, they're where consultation doesn't mean just listening to people, it means acting on the things that they say. But it also means that in that space of dialogue, there's some possibilities for expanded ideas. I mean, that's exactly what Balang was talking about finding the old and the new together. I just have a little tear because that was such a moving moment, and it was such a...
That's that inversion, I think, back to Chris's point.
Yeah.
Often art galleries, these temples to the previously rich and the currently wealthy, are about sacralising, deigning to sacralise other cultures or other civilizations who may have met the standards of the academy. What you're talking about, what Goenbi's talking about is sacralising a cross-cultural dialogue through Yolngu terms or through Maori terms. So there's another form of sacralisation that is, without getting romantic about that word, that is actually some of what museums and art galleries and the metaphysics of custodianship speak to. So in some ways what you guys are talking about there is probably the foundation stone for a different kind of cultural institution that happens in our cultural institutions through the grace of great artists and custodians every day. But as a starting point where they don't have to constantly intervene, but that's already there as a possibility.
So, John, I think that's right, and I think you picked up what I was wanting to suggest by emphasising the rich and the desacralising process of the secularising process of the Western Museum. I wanted to provoke a sense of the opposite, which is the great, to put one word on it, it's the great thing we can learn from Indigenous people, us non-Indigenous secular people. But it's a specific thing. It's not a generalised, it doesn't have a general, if it has a general character, it's going to disappear back into the abstraction and the vaults and categories and the disciplines, So just to add something, I totally agree with what's been said about the spirit of the sort of institution it would be wonderful to have. I think it should be one that looks at indigeneity and Australianness, and questions them as the outer limits of what's going on, and also nationality and as the outer limit of what's available. Because indigeneity and nationality, selfhood, living in the kind of world that's being created now, trying to survive the kinds of world that's coming in our direction, is going to require the connectivity, this movement that Maia talks about so well, not just in terms of people, but in terms of objects. But it's going to require sort of very specific sorts of connectivity that are constructive, and I keep saying coeval. We learn this from the critical anthropologists, where the exchange is an exchange not just between equals, but it's an exchange of different kinds of ways of being in the world and being in time. I have my own version of that relates to the kind of work I do as a teacher of graduate students. I also teach at the European Graduate School, which is in Switzerland, which is a kind of drop-in place for people who don't fit into any other graduate school program, to work with people who all themselves fit into programs, but also don't fit in other ways. And the model of it is an interdisciplinary space, and it's still European-based, but my vision has been to actually create an international network of connected places for rethinking the world, where we bring together not just interesting thinkers and artists and curators, but particularly cohorts of graduate students who will become, et cetera, et cetera. But make sure that their curriculum and their thinking is distributed across each of the continents of the world. So in a crucial sense, the kind of work done in one place about rethinking nationality, indigeneity, selfhood, what a culture is and so on, is done in a manner that is not just global, because that's another mistake, global's wrong, but worldly, right? It's actually world connecting. And that's been my dream. I've been able to put together bits of it, but not the whole thing. But something like it does in fact happen de facto between bits of universities and certain museums. There is an international cohort that's sort of there, and sometimes it meets in conferences like this and talks about a specific subject. But so whatever you do, please connect it with something like that. Don't make it just an Australian thing. Okay.
John, you wanted to respond.
Me, yeah, I guess so. I don't know about creating another United Nations, but I do think that just in practical terms, what happened? There were two things. I had two ideas, and one of them left. So we'll start with the second. Just in practical terms, you're talking about an institution. You're talking about what kind of institution there would be. There's always these discussions about what kind of an art institution, what kind of a cultural institution. I came to work when a space. There's a whole series of disused diesel tanks all around Sydney that were built there for the Second World War, because in case we were invaded or whatever, we had all this fuel everywhere, and they're really huge. They'd be 4 times the big as this room, and about 3 or 4 stories high. Now that big empty space is the best. I thought that is the best physical type of institution, and you can construct anything within that. It's like in one of those places in Germany, like a Kunsthalle. You want a big open space that's not restricted or defined, and then you can do anything within that space. That's one thing, I think, that allows your performance. You can do performance, you can show film, you can make film, make plays, you can do any of those things and make artworks of any scale. The problem is with each institution, we're all given a building that's built by somebody else. It used to be the town council building, or it used to be a law firm's building or something, or a factory, and you're restricted by that. So the best kind of thing would be this open space where you're not restricted, and then you can do that.
All right, I think we've got time for one last question. Would anybody like would anybody like to pop up on one last question?
Hello, thanks for this. This is great. I actually found this, I got pushed on Facebook somehow. Creepy Facebook found me and said, you need to come to this conference. But I own four works. They're very different, you know, and I bought them around 2001 in Sydney. But, you know, it seems to me like people think about Aboriginal art really as the old bark, you know, the stuff that was probably in the show 30 years ago. And what I have are very, very different pieces. Some of them are colorful, some of them are more of the traditional pattern. One is a traditional pattern, one is sort of a magical creatures, dream time kind of thing. And then one is a historical piece from about a massacre done by an artist named Queenie Mackenzie, and my daughters hate this picture. But it was, when I bought them, they were like, this is the best artist in this group that you're buying. But anyway, my question is this. So who is, in the Western traditional sense, is there a Vermeer, is there a Kandinsky in Aboriginal art? And, you know.
Yeah, he's here. You can come and have a drink with him later.
I understand who is here, but, you know, it would be great to promote those people, I think. I'm sorry, I went to the Darden School. I didn't go to the art history school here, so this is the way I think. But I'm just curious, if I am Bill and Melinda Gates and I want to buy some Australian art, where, you know, what would I be, who would I be looking at?
I'll buy you Queenie Mackenzie if your daughter doesn't like it.
What's that? Oh, yeah.
You know, I mean, I think that's a long question, and I think that one of the ways that we need to think about that is the regimes of value. That really what we've been talking about. Lauren, can you just? I think what we really need to talk about is sorry, lost my thread. That's about regimes of value, and a lot of what we've been talking about today is really about how do we shift those regimes of value? How do we think alternatives to those models, whether they be style or patronage, that have really dominated Western art, historical thinking and museum thinking. I can see that we're ticking very close to 4 o'clock, and we should continue all of these conversations at Kluge-Ruhe, but I really think I'd really like, if it's all right, at this moment, just to give Peter Sutton the last word, because really, this last session we've stepped away from dreamings, and I think it would just be a nice moment to just, you know, get your reflections on a day that has really celebrated, you know, something of which you were such an integral part of, Peter.
Yes, well, it's an unexpected pleasure to see the circle come around, and a circle, as you know, in Aboriginal tradition has a lot of meanings, but one of them is the suspension of hierarchy. Those who sit around a fire are, in a sense, all level. And that partly answers our friend's previous question. Who is the Michelangelo? Does that matter? In the Dreamings catalogue, we had a chapter which we thought would be necessary to clear the decks a bit. It was called Responding to Aboriginal Art. And it begins with a quotation from an art historical work of recent times, which contains miraculously in it about 6 key gems of European traditional views about what constitutes value in art, idealised beauty and so on. And one of those 5 or 6 things is the great artist, the one on the pedestal above all others. Now, classical Aboriginal society, as you would know, was intensely egalitarian. And although people with special skills were recognised as being specially good at painting, for example, there were values of discrimination between good painting and bad painting. Howard Morphy writes about that for the North East Arnhem Land region. That doesn't look like a goanna, go and start again. That sort of thing. But in putting that chapter in, we were saying what Aboriginal art was not, at least not in its classical forms. I think we've probably got beyond that now. The future is in terms of more positive approaches that can assume a greater ground knowledge in the audience to these works. And I'm still waiting for a profound book on non-traditional Aboriginal art. I don't think there's been one. I did foreshadow the need for one in the Dreamings catalogue. I used the term vacuum. I said, we have now created a vacuum that must be filled. Now it's going to be the younger people of this generation, not fogies of mine, who are going to have to fill that. Now the artists themselves can do it, but it may be that it takes 10 to tango, and some sort of collaborative effort, possibly involving the Kluge-Ruhe's graduate students, for example, might target this vacuum, and I would hope to see it filled.
What a great day it's been. Thank you to all of our speakers today. Balang John Moanjal, John Mundine, Chris Anderson, John Carty, Francoise Dussart, Mary Gard, Eleanor Newman, and Maia Nuku, Terry Smith, and Peter Sutton. We are so grateful for all of your contributions to a superb program. There's so many other people to acknowledge and thank for contributing both to the Beyond Dreamings exhibition and to the symposium. Lenders to the exhibition include Greg Castillo, who's here with us, John and Barbara Wilkerson, and the Wolfenson Family Foundation. Our sponsors include the Institute for Global Humanities and Cultures, and we really particularly want to thank Debjani Ganguly, the McIntyre Department of Art, the Office of Graduate and Postdoctoral Affairs, especially Deans Ed Barnaby and Philip Trella, and the Vice Provost for the Arts, Jody Kilbasa. The Embassy of Australia, particularly Beck Allen, and Maningrida Arts and Culture, with a special acknowledgement to Michelle Colpett for facilitating Balang's presence with us this week. We hope you will join us tonight at Kluge-Ruhe at 5:30 for a reception with all of the speakers, and tomorrow at 10:30 for a program with the speakers and our graduate student curators. Let's give everyone a warm round of applause. Thank you.